There is a brick in the British Museum that most people walk right past. It sits behind glass in the Middle East galleries, smaller than you would expect, the color of dry desert sand. But if you lean in close enough to read the cuneiform pressed into its surface, you find a name: Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, beloved of Marduk, restorer of Exile and Isidar, son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon. He put his name on tens of thousands of bricks just like this one. Tens of thousands, pressed into walls, buried in foundations, laid into the floors of temples and palaces across the greatest city the ancient world had ever seen. When archaeologists began excavating the ruins of Babylon in the 19th century, they found his name everywhere, under the rubble, inside the walls, beneath centuries of sand and silence. He wanted to be remembered. He did everything in his power to make sure of it. A few thousand miles away, in Jerusalem, the Israel Museum holds a different kind of memory. On ancient parchment, in careful handwriting, are words from the Book of Lamentations. Words written by people trying to describe something for which they had no adequate language. Words that begin, "Is it nothing to you? All who pass by. Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow." One name, two memories, two worlds with almost nothing in common. The brick says, here was the man who built Babylon, who served Marduk, who maintained the order of the world. The lament says, here was the man who burned Jerusalem, who destroyed the temple, who carried the people of God away in chains. Both of them are right. Neither of them is complete. This is the story of the distance between that brick and that lament. It is the story of what happens when a man spends his entire life trying to control how history remembers him, and discovers that the people he thought he had erased were the ones who decided. Picture a boy standing on the roof of a palace in Babylon. He is maybe 14 years old. The year is somewhere around 620 BCE. Below him, the city stretches in every direction. Not yet the Babylon that will make the ancient world stop and stare, but already the largest, most complicated place most people alive at that moment have ever seen. Canals run between neighborhoods like veins. The smell of the river mixes with the smell of 10,000 cooking fires. Somewhere in the distance, the great temple of Marduk rises above everything else, its stepped sides catching the last light of the afternoon. The boy's name is Nebuchadnezzar. His father, Nabopolassar, is downstairs doing the most important thing a king can do in the ancient world, which is surviving. 3 years ago, his father helped destroy Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, the city that had ruled the ancient Near East through organized terror for 3 centuries, the empire that forced conquered peoples to watch their own children killed, the empire whose kings carved images of themselves onto mountainsides just to make sure no one forgot what standing against Assyria looked like. That empire is gone now. Its capital, a smoking ruin. Its armies, scattered, and the boy on the roof knows what that means. It does not mean peace. It means a race. 3 powers are moving into the space Assyria left behind. From the northeast, the Medes, who helped bring Nineveh down and want their share of what follows. From the southwest, Egypt, under Pharaoh Necho II, pushing north into the Levant for the first time in generations. And here, in Babylon, his father, who started a revolution and won, and now has to figure out how to turn a revolution into something that lasts. The boy understands something that not everyone his age would understand. His father did not inherit Babylon. His father took it. There is no ancient bloodline behind the Chaldean dynasty. No unbroken chain of kings stretching back into the mythological past that gives Nabopolassar's rule the weight of inevitability. What gives it weight is results. The moment the results stop coming, the calculations begin. Other men start looking at the throne and doing the math. This is the world Nebuchadnezzar is growing up inside. Not the comfortable world of a crown prince who knows the throne is waiting for him. The anxious world of a dynasty that has to earn its right to exist every single year. He watches the city below him and already understands, in the way that children raised in the center of power understand things before they can articulate them, that the world he is looking at is his to keep or his to lose, that the distance between those two outcomes is not destiny. It is work. It is decision. It is the relentless, daily, never-finished business of making sure the order holds. He goes back inside. He has things to learn. The world after Nineveh is not waiting for anyone to finish their education. The Babylonian Chronicle records the moment without ceremony. Nabopolassar entrusted his army to his son Nebuchadnezzar. One sentence. No physical description. No backstory. No indication of how old the son was. What the father said before the handover, or what Nebuchadnezzar felt about being given command of the most powerful military force in the known world. Just the fact. Pressed into clay, waiting 26 centuries to be read. That gap, the space between what we know and what we do not know, is actually where the story begins. He was born into a dynasty that had no right to exist. His father Nabopolassar had seized power in Babylon not through inheritance but through revolution. He had taken advantage of Assyrian weakness, led a rebellion that most people probably thought would fail, and found himself king of a city that had spent generations being humiliated by the empire he had just helped destroy. That was the foundation, not a long line of legitimate ancestors, not centuries of sanctified rule, a bet that came in, and a crown that had to be justified every single day by the results it produced. Nebuchadnezzar would have understood this from the time he was old enough to understand anything. The dynasty's legitimacy was not given. It was earned, and it had to keep being earned. And the moment it stopped producing results, someone else would start making calculations about whether a different family might do better. This is not background detail. This is the engine of everything that follows. When we read the royal inscriptions Nebuchadnezzar left behind, what strikes you immediately is not the grandeur of the language, though the language is grand. It is the relentlessness of the justification. He does not simply list his achievements. He explains over and over why those achievements were sanctioned and guided by Marduk, the king of the gods, who had chosen him before birth for this exact purpose. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, beloved of Marduk, shepherd of the people, the one whom Marduk called by name to restore the temples. Read that carefully. He is not saying that he built the temples because he wanted to. He is saying that Marduk required this of him. He is not claiming the glory for himself. He is claiming that the glory belongs to the divine order that selected him as its instrument. This is a man building a case, not for his enemies, who would have to be defeated regardless of what he said, for the universe itself, or at least for the part of the universe that kept track of whether kings deserved to be kings. And at the same moment, in a completely different tradition, a Hebrew prophet was saying something that would have astonished any Babylonian who heard it. In the book of Jeremiah, the God of Israel speaks about Nebuchadnezzar using a word that carries enormous weight. He calls him my servant, not an enemy, not a monster, a servant, an instrument chosen for a specific task by a power that Nebuchadnezzar himself would never acknowledge. Two civilizations, two completely different theologies, both looking at the same man and seeing someone who had been chosen by their God to do something important. Neither of them was in conversation with the other. Neither of them knew what the other was saying, and yet they arrived at the same conclusion about Nebuchadnezzar, which was that he was not operating on his own authority. The difference was in what each tradition thought the task was. Babylon said, Marduk chose him to restore order, build the temples, maintain the cosmic arrangement that kept the world functioning. Israel said their God chose him to be an instrument of judgment against a people who had broken their covenant. Same man, two divine mandates, completely incompatible with each other. That incompatibility is not a puzzle to be solved. It is the heart of the story. Now, a word about something that appears in later tradition and deserves honesty. In later centuries, people would begin doing something interesting with Nebuchadnezzar. Ancient Greek and Roman sources connect him to a woman named Ametis, said to be a princess of the Medes, and to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which he supposedly built for her because she missed the green mountains of her homeland. The story is beautiful. A conqueror building an impossible garden in the middle of a desert city because his wife was homesick. The evidence, however, comes only from sources written centuries after Nebuchadnezzar lived. Ametis does not appear in any contemporary Babylonian record. The Hanging Gardens, listed by later Greek writers as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, have never been conclusively identified in the archaeological record at Babylon. Some scholars argue they may have existed at Nineveh instead. Others believe they were real but have not survived. What the story tells us, regardless of its historical accuracy, is that people in later centuries were already doing something with Nebuchadnezzar that went beyond historical record. They were making him into something larger than a king, a figure of legend, a man whose power was so total that even his personal life became a canvas for stories about what that much power feels like from the inside. That should tell you something about the scale of what we are dealing with. The young man who received command of his father's army in the early years of the 7th century BCE was not yet any of these things. He was a prince who had inherited a dynasty that had no right to exist, in a world that was still deciding what shape it wanted to take, carrying an understanding of order that had been pressed into him by every circumstance of his birth and upbringing. The world was not in order. It needed to be put in order. He was the one who was going to do it. Everything followed from that. In the summer of 605 BCE, 2 empires marched toward each other along the banks of the Euphrates River. On one side, the army of Babylon, commanded by Nebuchadnezzar, still a prince, still proving himself, leading the most powerful military force his father had ever assembled. On the other side, a combined force of Egyptians and the last remnants of Assyrian resistance, under Pharaoh Necho II, who had his own ideas about what the post-Assyrian world should look like and who should be running it. The city of Carchemish sat at the crossing point of the Euphrates in what is today northern Syria near the Turkish border. It had been a significant city for centuries, a place where trade routes crossed and empires had long competed for influence. But what happened there in 605 BCE was not about trade routes. It was about something much simpler and much larger at the same time. It was about who owned the world. The Babylonian Chronicle describes the outcome with its characteristic economy of language. The Egyptian army was defeated. Those who escaped the initial battle were pursued and finished off. Not a single Egyptian soldier made it home. What the Chronicle does not say, because it does not record things like this, is what it felt like to be Nebuchadnezzar in the hours after that victory. He was young. He had just destroyed the last serious military coalition that could challenge Babylonian dominance in the region. The Assyrian Empire that had humiliated Babylon for generations was finished. Egypt had been pushed back behind its own borders. Every small kingdom between the Euphrates and the Mediterranean coast now had only one calculation to make, which was how quickly to send tribute and how convincingly to express loyalty. The ancient Near East, for the first time in living memory, had a single dominant power, and Nebuchadnezzar had just proven he was the man who could command it. And then a messenger arrived from Babylon. Nabopolassar was dead. The Chronicle records this too, with the same calm it brings to everything. The king died in Babylon while his son was on campaign. The son received the news, transferred command of his army to his senior officers, and travelled from Carchemish to Babylon to take the throne. What the Chronicle cannot convey, but what we can understand if we think carefully about the situation, is what that journey meant. He had just won the defining battle of his generation. He had an army in the field, a victory to consolidate, captured territory to organize, and 100 administrative decisions that needed to be made before the momentum of the campaign was lost. Any general who has ever fought a war knows that the period immediately after a major victory is almost as dangerous as the battle itself. Enemy regroup. Allies start calculating their options. The machinery of conquest requires constant attention, or it begins to unravel. He left all of it. He handed command to subordinates he presumably trusted, took a small escort, and rode hard back to Babylon, hundreds of miles across desert and river valley, moving as fast as horses could carry him, because he understood something that no amount of battlefield brilliance could substitute for. There was no throne waiting safely for him in Babylon. There was a vacancy, and in the ancient world, a vacancy in a royal seat was an invitation, not a guarantee. The longer he stayed away from Babylon, the longer other men had to calculate whether they might fill that vacancy in his place. He could not let that happen. Dynasties fell in exactly these moments, when the heir was distant and distracted, and the people who wanted power saw their opening. His father had known something that had no inherited legitimacy behind it. The only thing keeping it standing was the continuous demonstration that the family in charge was worth following. He rode back to Babylon. He took the throne. He was king. The whole transition happened so fast that the historians who tried to reconstruct the timeline later found the dates difficult to reconcile. It appears that Nebuchadnezzar was crowned king of Babylon just 3 weeks after his father died. 3 weeks to travel hundreds of miles, conduct the necessary ceremonies, secure the loyalty of the court, and begin the business of governing the most powerful state in the world. 3 weeks. Now here is where Jerusalem enters the story for the first time. And the way it enters matters enormously for understanding everything that follows. On the road back from Carchemish to Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar passed through the Levant. He was moving through territory that his victory at Carchemish had just placed, at least theoretically, under Babylonian authority. The small kingdoms along that road had been watching the battle from a distance and drawing the obvious conclusions. Egypt had lost. Babylon had won. The math was simple. So, when the new king of Babylon came through, they sent delegations. They brought tribute. They offered submission in the formal language that these situations required. They were acknowledging that a new order had arrived, and that their survival depended on being on the right side of it. One of those delegations came from Judah, from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective, riding back to Babylon with the weight of his father's death and his own coronation pressing on him from every direction. Judah was a line item, a small kingdom in the hill country that had done the sensible thing and submitted without requiring a military response. One less problem. One more piece of the new order clicking into place. He almost certainly did not think about it again for years. That is the first thing to understand about the relationship between Nebuchadnezzar and Jerusalem. It did not begin as a collision of titans. It did not begin as the fulfillment of ancient prophecy or the clash of civilizations. It began as a bureaucratic acknowledgement from a minor kingdom on the edge of a larger concern. Jerusalem, in the summer of 605 BCE, was a name on a list of places that had submitted. Nothing more. The prophet Jeremiah saw it differently. He had been speaking for years already, telling the people of Judah things they did not want to hear. His description of the Battle of Carchemish, preserved in the 46th chapter of his book, does not read like political analysis. It reads like someone watching a storm come in from the horizon and knowing exactly what it means. He wrote about Egypt rising like the Nile, confident in its own power, moving north in its splendor. And then he wrote about what was going to happen to that splendor. The warriors would stumble. The mighty men would fall. The day belonged to something larger than any army. He was not celebrating Babylon. He was not endorsing Nebuchadnezzar. He was saying that the forces moving through history in that moment were larger than any of the human actors involved, and that anyone who thought they understood what had just happened at Carchemish was probably missing the most important part. Two people watching the same battle. Two completely different stories about what it meant. What Nebuchadnezzar saw as the establishment of proper order, the strong taking their rightful place over the weak. The chaos of the post-Assyrian world finally being resolved into something coherent and stable. Jeremiah saw as something moving through Babylon, without Babylon understanding its own role. Nebuchadnezzar rode on toward Babylon and his throne, carrying the absolute certainty that the world was finally being put in order. Behind him, on a hill in Judah, a prophet kept writing. Imagine a clay cylinder being inscribed. A scribe sits in a royal workshop in Babylon, in the early years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, carefully pressing a stylus into wet clay. He is working from a text that has already been approved, recording in the precise formal language of Babylonian royal inscription what the king has done and why he has done it. The text goes something like this: Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the one who cares for Ezagila and Ezida, the eldest son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon. When Marduk, the great lord, entrusted me with the care of his city and his people, I set my heart to do what is pleasing to him. I restored the temples. I rebuilt the walls. I laid the foundations with gold and silver and precious stones. He did not write these inscriptions because he was arrogant. He wrote them because they were documents, legal and theological and political, all at once, recording for the gods and for posterity that he had fulfilled his obligations. Every temple restored, every wall rebuilt, every canal dug was an item on a ledger that the universe kept, and the king was responsible for making sure the ledger balanced. But there is something underneath the formal language that becomes visible when you read enough of these inscriptions. Something that is not quite anxiety but is related to it. A quality of relentlessness, of a man who could not stop, who kept building and rebuilding and inscribing and documenting as if the moment he paused, the whole structure might begin to question its own foundations. This is the key to understanding Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. And it is also the key to understanding why Babylon was so completely different from Akhenaten's city in the Egyptian desert, built a few centuries earlier by a pharaoh with a new theology and a vision no one else could share. Akhenaten tore down the old system to build something new. He looked at the world his civilization had constructed over 2,000 years and decided it was wrong, and he started over. His city was a statement of rupture. Everything before it was the error. Everything after it was the correction. Nebuchadnezzar did the opposite. He looked at the world his civilization had constructed and decided it was right. That it had always been right. That the problem was not the system, but the interruption. Babylon had been suppressed by Assyria. The temples had been neglected. The proper order had been disrupted. His job was not to invent something new. His job was to restore something ancient, to rebuild it bigger and better than it had ever been, to make it so obviously magnificent that no reasonable person could look at it and argue that this was not how things were supposed to be. Where Akhenaten said, "Everything you believed was wrong. Here is the truth." Nebuchadnezzar said, "Everything you believed was right. And here is the proof." The difference between those two positions is the difference between two entirely different relationships with power and legitimacy. Akhenaten needed to convince people of something they had not seen before. Nebuchadnezzar needed to remind people of something they already knew. He just needed to make the reminder impossible to ignore. And so he built. The Ishtar Gate was the northern entrance to the city, reconstructed today in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, assembled from the glazed bricks that archaeologists excavated from the ruins of Babylon in the early 20th century. If you have seen photographs of it, you have some sense of what it was. If you have stood in front of it in person, you know that photographs do not prepare you. The gate was covered in glazed bricks of deep blue, the color of lapis lazuli, the color of the sky at the moment, just before it goes fully dark. Against that blue, in raised relief, marched the sacred animals of the Babylonian gods. The lion, symbol of Ishtar, goddess of love and war. The aurochs, the great wild bull associated with Adad, god of storms, and the dragon of Marduk, a creature with the body of a serpent, the forelegs of a lion, and the hind legs of an eagle, moving along the walls with a fluid, coiled power that still looks alive after 2,500 years. 120 lions lined the processional way that led to the gate, running along walls that extended for nearly a kilometer. The road itself was paved with white limestone and red stone, brought from distant mountains at enormous expense. The processional way was not a street, it was a statement. Every year, during the New Year festival, the Akitu, the statue of Marduk, was carried in procession down this road, from the main temple complex, through the Ishtar Gate, and out to the festival house on the edge of the city. The entire population of Babylon would have lined the route. Priests, soldiers, musicians, merchants, the delegations of foreign kings, the ambassadors of conquered territories, everyone who was part of the Babylonian world, or who wanted to survive within it, came to watch the king of the gods move through his city in triumph. And the king of Babylon walked with him, not as a spectator, not even as an organizer, as the earthly counterpart to Marduk's divine authority, the human representative of the cosmic order that the festival was renewing. In the theology of the Akitu, the king's participation was not ceremonial. It was necessary. Without the king performing his role correctly, the ritual did not work. Without the ritual working, the new year did not begin properly. Without the new year beginning properly, the rains might not come, the crops might not grow, and the world might begin to slip out of the arrangement that kept it functioning. This is what Nebuchadnezzar was maintaining every time he walked that road. And it was also what he was demonstrating to every ambassador, every foreign dignitary, every representative of every conquered people who stood along the route watching. Look at this city. Look at this road. Look at this gate. Look at the gods who live here and the king who serves them. This is what order looks like. This is the center of the world. And if your kingdom sits on the edge of this world, the question you need to ask yourself is not whether this power is real. The question is whether you want to be aligned with it or crushed by it. Beyond the gate and the processional way, the building continued. The walls of Babylon were the subject of wonder in the ancient world. The archaeological evidence confirms that the defenses of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar were on a scale that had no parallel. There was an outer wall, an inner wall, a moat, and a system of fortifications that made the city, for practical purposes, impregnable to any army that did not have months and the ability to starve the population into submission. The ziggurat of Babylon, known in ancient texts as Etemenanki, meaning house of the foundation of heaven and earth, rose to a height that ancient sources put at approximately 91 meters. It was the largest structure in Mesopotamia. Some scholars have suggested it was the basis for the story of the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis, a story that would have been known to the Jewish exiles who arrived in Babylon generations later and looked up at this enormous structure with complicated feelings. There is a question worth asking here that goes deeper than the usual questions about how he built all of this. The more interesting question is, why could he not stop? The inscriptions go on for years. Campaign after campaign of restoration and construction. New temples. New walls. New canals. New roads. The cylinder inscriptions record project after project in the same formal language, the same patient documentation of obligations fulfilled. But underneath the formality, when you read enough of them, you sense something that the formal language was not designed to convey. He was never finished, not because there was always more to build, though there was, but because the building itself was an argument that had to keep being made. The order he was constructing was not self-evident. It had to be demonstrated, continuously, through the accumulation of evidence. Every temple he restored was another brick in the case he was building. Every wall he raised was another line of the argument. Maybe the audience he was really building for was himself. Maybe the man pressing his name into 10,000 bricks was trying to answer a question that bricks alone could never answer. Who are you? If no one remembers you were here, he was about to find out, though not in the way he expected. Picture Babylon in the first days of spring. The city has been preparing for weeks. The temples have been cleaned and reconsecrated. The priests have completed their purification rituals. The streets along the processional way have been swept, and the great blue walls freshened where the winter had worn them. The smell of cedar, oil, and incense moves through the air from the temple precincts, mixing with the dust of a city waking up after the cold months. This is the Akitu, the New Year festival, the most important religious event in the Babylonian calendar, and in the first years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, the moment when everything he had inherited and everything he was building came together in a single day of public demonstration. He stands at the head of the procession on the processional way, wearing the robes of kingship, in front of more people than most human beings in the ancient world ever saw gathered in one place. Behind him and around him are the priests of Marduk, the military commanders, the court officials, the representatives of every province and every subject, people in the empire, and before him, carried on a golden litter by the senior priests, is the statue of Marduk himself, the king of the gods, being taken from his temple to the festival house at the edge of the city. In the theology of this moment, Nebuchadnezzar is not watching a religious ceremony. He is participating in the renewal of the cosmos. The festival drama reenacted the primordial battle in which Marduk defeated the chaos dragon Tiamat and created the ordered world from her body. By performing his role in the ritual correctly, the king was not merely commemorating that victory. He was, in the understanding of everyone present, making it happen again. The new year was not guaranteed. Order was not automatic. It had to be won, renewed, performed back into existence each time, and among the people standing along the processional way, watching the procession pass, were representatives of every people Babylon had conquered or received tribute from, delegations from Syria, from the cities of the Phoenician coast, from the kingdoms of the Transjordan, from the territories that had been Assyria. Their presence at the Akitu was itself a political statement. They were watching Marduk processed through his city in triumph, and their watching was an acknowledgement of what that triumph meant for them. But something else was also happening in that crowd, something that the official theology of the festival did not account for. Among the groups watching from the sides of the processional way were people who had been brought to Babylon from Judah. This had begun in the very first year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, when Judah submitted after Carchemish and sent tribute and, according to the book of Daniel, certain young men from the Judean nobility to be educated at the Babylonian court. This was standard imperial policy. You took the children of elite families from subject territories and brought them to the capital. You educated them in Babylonian language and literature and administration. You gave them Babylonian names. You integrated them into the Babylonian system so thoroughly that by the time they returned to their home territories, they were, in some important sense, Babylonian. It worked very well with most peoples. With Judah, it ran into something that Nebuchadnezzar's imperial machinery was not designed to handle. The young men who arrived from Jerusalem were given Babylonian names. They were enrolled in the educational program designed to produce Babylonian administrators. They were offered food from the royal table, the same food that had been presented before the gods in the daily ritual that maintained Babylon's relationship with the divine order, and some of them refused. Babylon's approach to conquered peoples and their gods was, by the standards of the ancient world, relatively tolerant. The policy was not destruction, but incorporation. When you conquered a territory, you brought its divine images to Babylon and placed them in the temples there, in a subordinate position to Marduk. The gods of the subject peoples were not denied. They were simply relocated to acknowledge the hierarchy that Marduk's victory had established. Your god existed. He just answered to the king of the gods now. This worked with the gods of most peoples, because most ancient religions operated within a shared framework. There were many gods. Each had a domain. Political relationships between peoples were mirrored in the relationships between their gods. If Babylon defeated Judah, it meant Marduk had demonstrated his superiority over whatever deity Judah served. Israel did not operate within that framework. The God of Israel was not one deity among many who happened to lose a battle. The God of Israel was the only God, the creator of everything that existed, the one before whom No other divine being had any standing at all. There was no position within the Babylonian theological hierarchy where he could be accommodated, because the Babylonian theological hierarchy was, from the Israelite perspective, not a hierarchy at all. It was a collection of things that did not exist, arranged in an order that had no basis in reality. You could not place the God of Israel below Marduk in the divine filing system, because the God of Israel did not acknowledge that the filing system existed. This was not stubbornness. It was not political resistance dressed up as religion. It was two completely different accounts of what the universe was and how it worked, and they were genuinely incompatible. From Babylon's side, the gods of all peoples exist within a single cosmic order, and Marduk rules that order. And if your gods have any wisdom, they will acknowledge this fact, because Babylon's military victories are the proof. From Israel's side, there is one God. He created the universe. He made a covenant with this particular people, and the fact that Babylon is currently winning militarily proves nothing about the divine order, because the divine order is not determined by military outcomes. You can see immediately why these two positions had nowhere to go. The book of Daniel preserves several stories from this period that capture something true about the nature of this collision, whatever their precise historical form. In one, Nebuchadnezzar builds a great golden statue and requires all the peoples of his empire to bow before it when they hear the sound of certain musical instruments. This is not simply vanity. In the context of ancient Near Eastern politics, it is a loyalty test. You demonstrate your allegiance to the imperial order through the act of physical submission before its symbols. Most peoples in the ancient world would have found this entirely acceptable. You bow before the symbol of the empire that controls your fate. What is the problem? For the Jewish exiles at the Babylonian court, bowing before a divine image was not a political act that could be separated from their religious commitments. It was a religious act that violated the commandment they considered fundamental above all others. You shall have no other gods before me. The commandment did not have an asterisk. 3 young men, according to the story, refused to bow, and Nebuchadnezzar found himself in a situation his theology of order had not prepared him for. He could execute them. He had people executed for far less. But these were not rebels in the political sense. They were not trying to overthrow Babylon. They were simply standing still while everyone around them bowed, and giving as their reason a claim that Nebuchadnezzar had no framework to evaluate, which was that there was a power greater than Babylon that they answered to, and that power had told them not to bow. The story in Daniel says he had them thrown into a furnace heated 7 times hotter than normal, and that something happened in that furnace that his observers could not explain, and that the 3 men walked out unharmed. Whether you read that story as literal history or as theological literature, it is communicating something precise about the encounter between Babylonian power and the thing it could not process. Babylon could imprison people. It could destroy cities. It could carry populations away from their land and scatter them across the empire. It could do all of these things and had done all of them and would do more of them. What it could not do was reach inside a person and change what they believed the universe was made of. Nebuchadnezzar walked back from the festival house after the Akitu procession with the satisfaction of a man who had performed the necessary rituals correctly and maintained the proper order of things. The gods were in their places. The king had fulfilled his obligations. The new year had been properly renewed. In the quarters assigned to the young men from Judah, some of those young men were sitting with their own texts, their own prayers, their own understanding of what the universe was and why they were in it. 2 worlds in the same city. both completely convinced they were right. One of them was going to leave a mark on history that the other could not have imagined. Take a map of the ancient Near East and find the thin strip of territory running along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. This is the Levant. From north to south, it runs perhaps 500 miles. At its widest point, it is perhaps 100 miles from the coast to the desert interior. It sits at the exact junction where Africa, Asia, and Europe come as close to each other as they do anywhere on Earth. Every empire that rose in the ancient Near East needed to control this strip of land. Not because of what was in it. Though the Phoenician ports on the coast were significant trading centers, because of what it connected. If you controlled the Levant, you controlled the land bridge between Mesopotamia and Egypt. You could move armies in either direction. You could tax the trade that flowed along that route. You could project power in ways that were simply not possible if someone else held that corridor. This is the geography that determined Judah's fate long before Nebuchadnezzar was born. Jerusalem sat in the hill country near the center of this strip, in a position that was defensible but not isolated, important but not so obviously strategic that every passing empire made it an immediate priority. For much of the previous 2 centuries, Judah had survived by being useful to whoever was dominant at the time, and by being small enough that absorbing it was not worth the trouble of conquest. That calculation worked until the world changed. When Assyria collapsed and Babylon and Egypt began competing for control of the region, Judah suddenly found itself in the worst possible position. It was too important to be left alone and too weak to determine its own future. Every decision its kings made was a decision between 2 forms of danger. Side with Babylon and you risked Egyptian retaliation. Side with Egypt and you risked Babylonian retaliation. Stay neutral, and both sides read your neutrality as hostility. There is a habit, in later reading of this period, of judging the kings of Judah harshly for the choices they made. That habit misses what they were actually dealing with. Jehoiakim inherited a kingdom that had just watched Egypt kill his father Josiah at the Battle of Megiddo. He had been placed on the throne by Pharaoh Necho himself. As an Egyptian client, when Babylon defeated Egypt at Carchemish and became the dominant power, Jehoiakim submitted because the alternative was immediate military response. He paid tribute for several years, and then he stopped paying. Was that foolish? From the outside, looking back, it is easy to say yes. But Jehoiakim had received assurances from Egypt that Pharaoh's defeat at Carchemish was not the end of the story, that Egypt would return, and that when Egypt returned, it would be worth having maintained some distance from Babylon. Egypt was a civilization that had been operating for 2,000 years before Nebuchadnezzar was born. It had survived many setbacks. It would survive this one too. He was right that Egypt would survive. He was wrong that Egypt would return in time. Jeremiah told him so. And here it is worth stopping on Jeremiah for a moment, because he is more than a voice delivering warnings in this story. He is a man living inside an impossible situation, watching from close range as his city moved towards something he understood clearly and could not stop. He had been speaking since the 13th year of King Josiah, roughly 627 BCE, which means, by the time the crisis with Babylon reached its worst point, he had been delivering unpopular messages to ungrateful audiences for decades. He was arrested and put in stocks. He was thrown into a muddy cistern and left to die before a sympathetic official had him pulled out. He was confined to the court of the guard. Through all of it, he kept writing. He was not a comfortable man to be around. He did not soften his words to make them easier to hear. He stood in the gates of the temple and told anyone who would listen that trusting Egypt was the wrong calculation and that Babylon was coming, and that the only path that led to survival was submission. He wrote a scroll summarizing his prophecies and had it read in the temple. When Jehoiakim heard what was in the scroll, he cut it apart with a knife, piece by piece, as it was being read to him, and threw the pieces into the fire. Then he had Jeremiah arrested. Jeremiah escaped, went into hiding, and dictated the scroll again from memory. This is not the behavior of a man interested in being popular. This is the behavior of a man who believes he is seeing something clearly and cannot bring himself to say anything other than what he sees, regardless of the cost. Being right about a catastrophe does not protect you from living through it. Jeremiah would live through everything that followed. He would watch every warning he had given come true, honor by on, with the particular anguish of someone who never wanted to be right about any of it. The people of Judah, at every level of society, also carried a memory that was not easily overridden by military reality. 100 years before Nebuchadnezzar, the Assyrian king Sennacherib had besieged Jerusalem with an army that by any reasonable military calculation should have taken the city. The Bible records that the Assyrian army was struck down in the night, and Sennacherib withdrew. Jerusalem survived without being taken. That story was not ancient history to the people of Jerusalem in 600 BCE. It was within living memory. It was the defining example of what their God did when his city was threatened. It had happened once. The theological expectation that Jerusalem was under special divine protection was not wishful thinking. It was the conclusion that reasonable people drew from the most dramatic event in recent Judean history. Jeremiah's message was therefore doubly impossible to hear. He was not just telling people to make a politically difficult choice. He was telling them that the thing they most deeply believed about their God and their city was, in this particular moment, not going to work the way it worked before. That the protection was conditional, not permanent, and that the conditions had changed. People do not hear that message easily from anyone. They did not hear it from Jeremiah. When Jehoiakim died, his son, Jehoiakim, was 18 years old and had been king for 3 months when Nebuchadnezzar arrived at the walls of Jerusalem for the first time. The young king came out and surrendered. The city did not have to fight. The temple was not touched. A large group of the population's elite was taken to Babylon. The best craftsmen and soldiers and administrators, the people who made a city function at the highest level, in their place. Nebuchadnezzar installed a king of his own choosing, a man named Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, who was given the name Zedekiah. Zedekiah was not a bad man. He was not stupid. He was a man placed in an impossible position by forces he did not choose and could not control, surrounded by advisors whose interests pulled in different directions, governing a people whose theological convictions made political realism feel like spiritual cowardice. He lasted 11 years before everything came apart. And Jeremiah, who had been right about everything, was still there when it did, still saying the things no one wanted to hear, still writing it all down. There is a clay tablet in the British Museum, catalogue number BM 21946, that scholars refer to as the Babylonian Chronicle, ABC 5. It is not large. It is not particularly impressive to look at. It is a rectangle of baked clay covered in small, precise cuneiform marks, and it sits in the same building as the Assyrian lion hunt reliefs that announce themselves immediately as spectacular. Most visitors to the British Museum never find it. Most of those who do spend about 30 seconds looking at it before moving on to something more visually arresting. This is a mistake. ABC 5 is one of the most important historical documents that survives from the ancient world. Not because of what it says in a general sense, but because of what it says about a specific moment that people have been trying to understand for 2,500 years. It records, among other events, the first Babylonian capture of Jerusalem, and it records it in a way that tells you everything you need to know about the difference between history as the conqueror experiences it and history as the conquered remember it. The relevant passage reads as follows. In the 7th year, the month of Kislev, the king of Akkad mustered his troops, marched to the Hattiland, and encamped against the city of Judah, and on the 2nd day of the month of Adar he seized the city and captured the king. He appointed there a king of his own choice, received its heavy tribute, and brought them to Babylon. That is all. No names, no description of the fighting. If there was fighting, no account of what was taken or who was killed or what the city looked like when it was over. Just the administrative record of a military operation that was completed on schedule and produced the expected results. Siege, capture, replacement of leadership, collection of tribute, movement of population. From the Babylonian perspective, this was a successful outcome to a straightforward problem. Sheet, a subject territory, had been insufficiently loyal. It had required a direct military response. The response had been delivered. The territory was now back in its proper relationship to the imperial center. Order had been restored. The economy of the Chronicle's language is not cruelty. It is the grammar of empire. Empires do not record their military operations in the language of the people they are operating on. They record them in the language of the people doing the operating, which is the language of logistics and outcomes and strategic objectives met or unmet. From that perspective, the first fall of Jerusalem in 597 BCE was not a significant event. It was a routine correction. Now read what the Hebrew tradition preserved about the same day. The Book of Kings records it from the inside. King Jehoiachin, his mother, his servants, his officials, and his court officials came out to surrender. Nebuchadnezzar took him prisoner. He took away the treasures of the temple and the palace, cut up the gold vessels that Solomon had made for the temple, and carried away all Jerusalem, all the officers and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and the smiths. He left none of the population except the poorest people, 10,000 people, from a city that probably had a total population of somewhere between 25,000 and 40,000 at the time. Losing 10,000 of its most skilled and educated citizens in a single operation was not a logistical adjustment. It was an amputation, and yet even that is not the deepest layer of what the Hebrew sources are recording. What the books of Kings and Chronicles and the prophets are trying to capture is not primarily the physical loss, though the physical loss was enormous. It is the theological rupture. Because what Nebuchadnezzar did on the 2nd of Adar in the 7th year of his reign was not, from the Israelite perspective, simply a military action. It was an event that required explanation in terms of why God had allowed it to happen. That question, why did God allow this, is one of the most generative questions in the history of religion. It does not have an easy answer. It did not have an easy answer in 597 BCE, and it does not have an easy answer now. But the Hebrew tradition did not flinch from asking it. And the books written during and after the exile are, among other things, an extended attempt to think through what this event meant about the relationship between God and Israel, and what faithfulness looked like in a world where the expected divine protection had not materialized in the expected way. Jeremiah's answer was that the exile was not a sign that God had abandoned Israel, but that Israel had broken the covenant repeatedly, and this was the consequence. The exile was judgment, not abandonment. God was still present. The situation was terrible, but it was not permanent. Ezekiel, who was among those taken to Babylon in 597, had visions of God's presence moving, not fixed permanently to the temple in Jerusalem, but capable of going where the people went. The God of Israel was not a local deity tied to a particular piece of real estate. He was the God of the universe, and the universe extended to Babylon. These theological responses are not just coping mechanisms, though they are also coping mechanisms. They are genuine, intellectual and spiritual work done under extreme pressure, trying to hold together a coherent account of reality when the events of history seem to be pulling that account apart. And while that work was being done in the displaced Jewish community, something else was happening that the Hebrew record preserves, but does not quite know what to make of. In Babylon, Jehoiachin was kept alive. This detail would be interesting in any case, but it became remarkable when archaeologists excavating the ruins of Babylon in the early 20th century found, among the administrative tablets from the royal palace, several records from around 592 to 590 BCE that listed recipients of rations distributed from the royal storehouses. One entry reads, 10 selah of oil to Joachim, king of the land of Judah, 2.5 selah of oil to the 5 sons of the king of Judah. Joachim is Jehoiachin. The king who had surrendered Jerusalem was being housed and fed in Babylon. His sons were with him. They were receiving a regular allocation from the palace administration, the same kind of allocation provided to other foreign hostages and diplomatic guests held at the Babylonian court. He was a prisoner, but he was a prisoner who was eating regularly and living with his family. This detail does not fit neatly into either the Babylonian or the Hebrew narrative of what happened in 597. From the Babylonian side, it is simply administration. You keep useful hostages alive and reasonably comfortable because dead hostages serve no purpose, and mistreated hostages create resentment that complicates future relationships. From the Hebrew side, this detail carries a very different kind of weight. Jehoiachin in Babylon, still alive, still acknowledged as the king of Judah in the imperial records, still with his sons around him, was a kind of ember. He was the legitimate Davidic king in exile. As long as he was alive, the line of David had not been extinguished. As long as that line continued, the promises attached to it were still theoretically in play. The two readings of that ration allocation exist simultaneously and cannot be merged into a single story. For Babylon, it is a bookkeeping entry. For Israel, it is a thread of hope in the darkest period the nation had experienced in generations. Nebuchadnezzar, if he thought about Jehoiachin at all after the initial capture, probably thought about him in the first terms: a useful asset, a claim on the loyalty of the Judean population still in Palestine, to be deployed or discarded as circumstances required. He did not think about him as a thread of hope. He could not have. That was not a category his world contained. And in the city of Jerusalem, after the deportees had been marched north and east toward the Euphrates, a new king sat on the throne, Zedekiah, appointed by Babylon and therefore regarded by a significant portion of his own people as illegitimate, trying to govern a city that had just lost its best craftsmen and its most senior officials and most of its military leadership. He swore an oath to Nebuchadnezzar, an oath sworn in the name of God. According to the book of Chronicles, he would remain loyal, he would pay tribute, he would maintain the relationship. He meant it when he swore it. The oath lasted 11 years. He does not have a name in any record that survives. We know he was young, probably in his 20s, one of the educated men taken from Jerusalem to Babylon in 597. We know he was from a family significant enough to be included in the group that Nebuchadnezzar considered worth bringing back to the imperial center. Beyond that, the record is silent, so we follow him with what we know about the world he moved through, which is considerable. He left Jerusalem in a group. The Chronicle calls them deportees. The Book of Kings calls them captives. Neither word quite captures the physical experience of what it meant to walk away from the city where your family had lived for generations, where your parents were buried, where the temple stood on its hill, visible from almost anywhere in the surrounding countryside, and understand that you did not know when or whether you would see any of it again. The journey to Babylon was approximately 900 miles. You did not travel in a straight line. The direct route across the Syrian desert was not practical for a large group of people on foot. You followed the arc of habitable land that curved north through Syria before descending south again along the Euphrates toward Babylon. The journey took weeks, somewhere on that road, possibly at the point where the land of Israel fell definitively behind the horizon, and there was nothing ahead but foreign territory. The weight of the thing would have become completely real in a way that it perhaps had not been before. There is a phrase from the book of Jeremiah that captures something about that moment. God tells the exiles, through Jeremiah, to build houses and plant gardens and seek the welfare of the city where they have been sent. It is practical advice. It is also devastating advice. Because the only reason you have to tell people to build houses in a foreign city is if they are sitting there waiting to go home, unable to believe that going home is not imminent. They had to be told to unpack. He carried something with him on that journey. Most people who have studied the literature produced in Babylon during the exile assume that the exiles brought what they could carry of their religious texts, their scrolls, the accumulated written tradition of their people, not the whole archive, but pieces of it, enough to remember who they were and what the covenant meant and what the promises had said. He arrived in Babylon, and Babylon was not what he had imagined. He came through the Ishtar gate. Later in his life, if he lived long enough to have a later life, he probably could not have described it without his voice changing. Deep blue glaze, the color of a sky he had never seen before. Lions running along walls that went on further than made sense. The dragon of Marduk, moving in, raised relief above his head as he passed through. So large and so detailed that in the right light it looked less like a decoration than like something waiting to become real. He had grown up in Jerusalem, a city built on a hill in the Judean highlands, beautiful in its own way, dominated by the temple that sat at its highest point and gave the city its reason for existing. The temple was not architecturally modest. It was the finest thing his civilization had produced, covered in gold and cedar, wood and bronze, filled with objects of extraordinary craftsmanship. But the Ishtar Gate was not the temple. The Ishtar Gate was not trying to be the temple. The Ishtar Gate was the entrance to a city that had been built to make every other city in the world feel provisional by comparison, and it succeeded with an efficiency that left no room for comfortable dismissal. He stood in the gateway and felt something that did not have a clean name. Not admiration. Exactly. Not despair. Something more complicated and more uncomfortable than either of those, because the gate was beautiful in a way that raised a question he was not sure he wanted to answer. If the God of Israel was the God who created everything, And if Babylon was part of everything, then Babylon's beauty was not separate from that creation. The hands that shaped these glazed bricks were human hands, working with clay and fire, and the knowledge of craft that came from centuries of Mesopotamian tradition. There was nothing supernatural about how the gate had been made. It had been made by people, using skill and labor and time, and some of those resources had come from Judah. Some of the tribute that Jerusalem, he was looking at something that he had, in some small and terrible way, helped to build. He moved through the gate and into the city. Babylon, inside the walls, was everything the gate had promised. The processional way opened before him, flanked by the lion reliefs, leading toward the great ziggurat that rose against the Babylonian sky in the middle distance. The streets were organized. The markets were full, the smell of a city in full operation. Food and animals and incense and the river surrounded him completely. This was where he was going to live now. The exiles were not thrown into dungeons. The Babylonian approach to absorbed populations was more sophisticated than that. You settled them in communities, allowed them to maintain their cultural practices within limits, assigned them land to farm or trades to practice, and integrated them into the economic life of the empire. There are records from the period showing Jewish names in Babylonian commercial documents, Jewish families buying and selling land, Jewish merchants operating within Babylonian trade networks. They were prisoners who were expected to build houses and plant gardens. In the evenings, in whatever space they had made their own in this foreign city, he would have taken out the texts he had carried from Jerusalem and read them. He was not reading them the way he had read them in Jerusalem, as part of the institutional life of the temple, with priests and rituals and the whole apparatus of official worship surrounding the act of reading. He was reading them the way a man reads a letter from someone he loves who is very far away, for the presence in the words more than for the information in them. And in doing so, without knowing it, he was doing something that no one had done before, in quite the same way. He was practicing a religion without a temple, without a land, without the physical location that everything in his tradition said was necessary for the proper relationship between God and people. He was discovering, by necessity, that the texts could travel in a way that the temple could not, that what had seemed like the container of his faith was actually the contents of it. This discovery was not complete in that first year. It was not complete in the first decade. It was the work of a generation, and it required suffering and confusion and the extended labor of people far more theologically sophisticated than our unnamed young man from Jerusalem. But it started with people like him, reading familiar words in an unfamiliar city, wondering what it meant that the words still worked when everything else had changed. Outside his window, the lamps of Babylon burned long into the night. The city that had taken him from his home went about its business with the indifference of something too large to notice what it had swallowed. And the words on his scrolls said, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept. When we remembered Zion." Someone else would write that line later. After more had happened, after the temple burned, but the feeling in it was already true. He was already sitting by the rivers, already remembering. The fire had not come yet. In the 9th year of his reign, Zedekiah did the thing that Jeremiah had spent years telling him not to do. He stopped paying tribute to Babylon. The decision did not come from nowhere. By 589 BCE, 11 years after Nebuchadnezzar had placed him on the throne of Judah, Zedekiah was governing a city under pressures that pulled in every direction at once. And the pressure that finally won was not stupidity or faithlessness or a simple desire to be free. It was something more complicated and more human than any of those things. To understand what Zedekiah did and why, you have to understand what it meant to be king of Judah in the decade between the first deportation and the final siege. He was not the legitimate king in the eyes of a significant portion of his own people. Jehoiakim, the king who had surrendered the city in 597, was still alive in Babylon. The Davidic covenant ran through Jehoiachin, not through Zedekiah, and there were people in Jerusalem who made this point whenever they thought the political weather permitted. Zedekiah governed a city that had already lost its best people, its finest craftsmen, its senior priests and officials, the network of talent and experience that a capital city needs to function at full capacity. He governed with a court that was partly made up of men who had their own interests in how the next chapter of the story turned out, and he governed a people who carried the memory of Sennacherib's failed siege, the theological conviction that Jerusalem was under special divine protection, the belief that what had happened to the Assyrians outside these walls could happen again. Pharaoh Hophra of Egypt sent signals that he was willing to support a Judean rebellion. This was not fantasy on Zedekiah's part. Egypt had genuine strategic interests in preventing Babylon from consolidating permanent control over the Levant. An independent or semi-independent Judah was more useful to Egypt than a Babylonian province. The offer of Egyptian backing was real, and the military assessment behind it was not unreasonable. Coalitions had brought down Assyria. Perhaps a coalition could check Babylon. The court factions, who wanted resistance, had an argument. The theological tradition pointed toward divine protection. Egypt was promising support, and Jeremiah was saying things that felt, to people who had not spent years developing the capacity to hear catastrophic news without turning away from it, like surrender dressed up in the language of faithfulness. Zedekiah made his decision. The book of Jeremiah records that Zedekiah sought out the prophet during this period. Not publicly, a private meeting in the palace, where the king could ask Jeremiah directly what God was saying without the political consequences of being seen to take him seriously. Zedekiah had a complicated relationship with Jeremiah. He did not dismiss him the way Jehoiakim had. He listened. He asked questions. He seems to have genuinely believed that Jeremiah was hearing something real. But there was a gap between believing a man is hearing something real and being willing to act on what he says, when acting on it means surrendering your city without a fight and handing yourself over to the power that put you on your throne in the first place. Jeremiah told him what he had been saying for years. Submit to Babylon. Surrender the city. Surrender yourself. You and the city will survive. Fight, and neither of you will. Zedekiah listened. He could not do it. Not because he was a coward, because doing what Jeremiah asked required something almost impossible for a king in his position, which was to publicly act as though the thing his entire people believed about their God and their city was not going to save them. To walk out of the gate and hand over the keys before the walls were even breached. To tell everyone who had been living inside the story of Sennacherib's defeat that this time the story was not going to end that way. He was not able to be that king. There is a passage in the book of Ezekiel that describes Nebuchadnezzar. Upon receiving the news of Judah's rebellion, standing at a crossroads and performing divination to determine his route of attack, he shook arrows. He consulted images. He examined a liver. The Babylonian practice of reading a sacrificed animal's liver for divine guidance was a sophisticated system of confirming strategic choices through theological sanction. It was not superstition. It was the Babylonian equivalent of consulting the full weight of your civilization's accumulated wisdom before committing to an irreversible course of action. The divination pointed to Jerusalem, What the divination told Nebuchadnezzar was not primarily military. He already knew the military situation. Judah was a small kingdom with a walled capital and no serious army. The military outcome was not in doubt. What the divination was confirming, in the theological language that translated strategic reality into divine mandate, was that the exception he had made in 597, the relatively restrained response that had preserved the city and its temple and its population, had not produced the compliance it was supposed to produce. Zedekiah had sworn an oath to Nebuchadnezzar in the name of his God. The book of Chronicles is explicit about this. It was not a political agreement between rulers. It was a covenant, sworn before the divine witness of Israel's own deity. And Zedekiah had broken it. From the Babylonian perspective, this was rebellion, requiring full military response. From the Israelite perspective, as both Ezekiel and Jeremiah saw it, this was something worse. Zedekiah had involved the divine name in a political calculation and then discarded it when the calculation changed. Whatever Babylon was going to do to Jerusalem now, it was going to happen in the shadow of a broken covenant, not just with Nebuchadnezzar, but with the God in whose name the oath had been sworn. Jeremiah was still in Jerusalem when the Babylonian siege lines appeared around the city. He had been saying for years that this was coming. He had been arrested and put in stocks and thrown into a muddy cistern and dragged back out again and arrested again and confined to the court of the guard. None of it had stopped him. He kept writing. He kept speaking. He kept recording what he saw and what he understood in the long arc of his people's history that most of his contemporaries could not see because they were too close to it and too frightened to look directly at it. When the siege lines appeared, he did not say he had told them so. What the record preserves is a man continuing to speak the truth as he understood it in a situation where almost no one wanted to hear it, because the alternative to speaking was a silence that would have meant abandoning everything he believed. Babylon's army encamped around the city, inside the walls. The last king of the Davidic line began the slowest and most terrible kind of defeat, not the kind that happens in a single decisive moment, but across 18 months of watching the food run out and the walls hold and the Egyptian relief force appear on the horizon and then turn back, and the walls continue to hold and the food continue to run out. Zedekiah stood on the walls of a city that was dying by inches and waited for a miracle that Jeremiah had told him was not coming. The miracle did not come. What came instead was the thing that Jeremiah had seen clearly from the beginning. Not because he was smarter than the kings and the false prophets and the court officials who had dismissed him, because he had been willing to keep looking at something that everyone else had needed to look away from. The siege tightened. The months passed. The food ran out. And in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar waited with the patience of a man who had built an empire on his understanding of how long walls can hold when no one is coming to relieve them. He had done this before. He knew how it ended. 3 perspectives. The same night, outside the walls of Jerusalem, in the Babylonian siege camp, a military scribe is working by lamplight, pressing a stylus into wet clay. He has been recording the progress of this siege for 18 months in the same administrative language he uses for everything else. Supply allocations, casualty figures, engineering assessments of the wall's condition, requests for additional equipment forwarded to the quartermaster. His tablets are not a narrative of what is happening. They are a management record of an operation in progress. Tonight's entry will note that the northern section of the wall has been breached, that the city garrison is no longer organized resistance, that the mopping up has begun. He writes it with the same economy of language that describes a delivery of grain or a rotation of troops. The operation has proceeded according to expectation. Results consistent with projections. He seals the tablet and reaches for another. Inside the walls, she has not eaten in 3 days. Her children have not eaten in longer. The city has been on starvation rations for months. People have been dying not from Babylonian swords, but from the slow arithmetic of a siege. The daily subtraction of food from people who need it to stay alive. She is in a lower room dug into the hillside where the city was built. She has her children with her. She has been listening to sounds she has never heard before. The sounds of a walled city being entered by an army from the wrong side, and trying to understand what those sounds mean for what happens next. She does not know yet. No one inside the walls knows yet. What they know is that the wall has failed, and the wall failing is the thing that was not supposed to happen, the thing that Sennacherib could not make happen, the thing that the faith of this city had been built around for 100 years. She holds her children in the dark and waits. At the Babylonian headquarters, outside the walls, Nebuchadnezzar is not in the city. He does not lead from the front during siege operations. He is at Riblah, a city in Syria that serves as his regional command post, far enough from the siege to maintain the strategic perspective that operational command requires, close enough to receive reports quickly and redirect resources if needed. Reports have been arriving all evening. The wall is breached. The garrison is collapsing. The king of Judah is attempting to flee through the southern gate with a remnant of his forces. He is reading these reports with the attention of a man who has been through enough of these operations to know that the critical decisions come not during the fighting, but in the hours after. What happens to the city's population? What happens to the temple and its contents? What happens to the king who broke his oath? He gives orders. The orders are recorded and dispatched. He does not see what is happening inside the walls. He only sees the reports. Now, hold those 3 perspectives together, because they are all happening simultaneously on the same night in 586 BCE, and none of the people in them can see the others. The scribe, writing his administrative record, cannot see the woman in the basement. The woman in the basement cannot see Nebuchadnezzar reading dispatches at Riblah. Nebuchadnezzar reading dispatches at Riblah cannot see either of them. They are living through the same event in completely separate worlds, and the event means something entirely different in each of those worlds, and none of them knows what it means in the others. Zedekiah fled through the southeastern gate with his soldiers and was overtaken by the Babylonian cavalry on the plains of Jericho. He was brought to Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah. The Book of Kings records what happened there, with a flatness that is, in its way, more disturbing than any dramatic description could be. Nebuchadnezzar slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then he put out the eyes of Zedekiah and bound him in chains of bronze and brought him to Babylon, where he remained until the day of his death. The last thing Zedekiah ever saw was the death of his sons. This was not casual cruelty. In the logic of the ancient Near East, it was a specific punishment for a specific crime. Zedekiah had broken a covenant oath, sworn in the name of his own God. He had used the divine name as a guarantee, and then violated the guarantee. The punishment was designed to be total and irreversible, and to communicate to everyone who heard about it the cost of that particular kind of betrayal. From the Babylonian perspective, this was justice. Order had been violated. The violation had been punished. The account had been settled. From the Hebrew perspective, this was the moment when the curtain of the final catastrophe opened fully, because Zedekiah blinded and in chains meant the line of David in bondage, which meant the promises attached to that line were in a condition that no one who had made those promises had ever seemed to anticipate or explain. Nebuchadnezzar's General Nebuzaradan entered Jerusalem with orders. The Book of Kings records what those orders produced. He burned the temple, he burned the palace, he burned every significant building in Jerusalem. He broke down the walls. He took into exile most of those who remained in the city. He left behind only some of the poorest people of the land to be vine dressers and ploughmen. The Temple of Solomon, which had stood for approximately 400 years, which had been the center of Israelite worship and the dwelling place of the divine presence since the time of Solomon, was gone. The walls of Jerusalem were rubble. The Davidic king was in Babylon. Blind. The city was empty. Now here is the thing that requires the most careful attention, because it is the thing that the scribe's clay tablet and the woman's basement and Nebuchadnezzar's dispatch reports all share without any of them knowing it. For the Babylonian military record, this was the successful conclusion of a punitive campaign against a rebellious tributary. The threat to regional order had been eliminated. The territory had been pacified. The resources of the temple and the palace had been transferred to Babylon, where they were catalogued and incorporated into the imperial treasury. Standard procedure. The operation was closed. For the people of Judah, the world had ended. Those are not metaphors for the same event. They are two completely different events that happen to occupy the same physical space on the same night. When Babylon burned the temple, it burned a building, a large, significant, religiously important building, but a building. Buildings can be replaced. The imperial logic had no category for a building that could not be replaced, for a loss that was not primarily architectural. When Israel lost the temple, it lost the place where heaven and earth met, the place where the presence of God had dwelt visibly among the people, the place where the blood of atonement was offered, the place without which the entire system of covenant relationship between God and Israel had no physical anchor. The Book of Lamentations was written in the immediate aftermath of this event by someone trying to find words for what could not quite be said in ordinary language. Is it nothing to you, all who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought upon me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger. That line was not written for Babylon. Babylon was not passing by. It had done what it came to do and moved on. That line was written for anyone, in any generation, who might stop and look at what had happened here and be willing to sit with the weight of it for a moment. It is still being read. The fire went out eventually. The stones were still hot when the first light came. The scribe in the siege camp sealed his final tablet for the evening and set it aside to dry. The woman in the basement held her children and waited for the sounds outside to change. Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah read the final dispatch of the night and made note of what needed to happen next. 3 worlds. The same dawn. None of them would ever be the same again, particularly the one that did not know yet what it was becoming. Someone wrote this down. We do not know who. We do not know exactly when, though the scholarship points to the period of the exile itself, or shortly after. We do not know whether the person who wrote it was one of the original deportees from 597, or one of those taken after the destruction of 586, or one of their children who had never seen Jerusalem but had grown up inside the memory of it. What we know is the words, "By the rivers of Babylon. There we sat down and wept. When we remembered Zion, on the willows there we hung up our lyres, for there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Psalm 137, 9 verses. Almost every line carrying the weight of a people trying to remember who they are in a place that was not made for them. That question, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land, is the hinge on which everything in this chapter turns. Because the answer that the exilic community eventually found was not the answer anyone would have predicted, and it changed the history of religion in ways that are still reverberating 26 centuries later. But before the answer, there was the question itself, and the question was real and it hurt. Babylon did not stop functioning because the exiles were sad. This is the detail that is hardest to sit with, and it is also the most important detail for understanding what the exile actually was as a lived experience rather than as a historical category. Nebuchadnezzar's building programs continued. The Akitu festival happened every spring. The markets operated. The canals were maintained. The empire administered its territories with the efficiency that had made it the dominant power in the ancient world. From Babylon's perspective, the arrival of several thousand Judean exiles was an administrative event. They needed to be housed and assigned to productive work and integrated into the economic life of the empire. The empire was good at this. It had been doing it with conquered populations for generations. The exiles were settled in communities. Some were settled at a place called Tel Abib, along a canal called the Chebar River, which is where Ezekiel received his extraordinary visions of the divine chariot. Others were settled elsewhere, in the Babylonian heartland. They were given land to farm. They were permitted to maintain their community structures. They were allowed, within limits, to continue their religious practices. Over time, many of them built houses, planted gardens, had children, established businesses. The Babylonian commercial records that survive from this period include Jewish names in trade documents, in property transactions, in the normal administrative paperwork of economic life. Some of the exiles became, by material standards, moderately prosperous. This was the genius and the horror of Babylon's approach to absorbed populations. It did not require you to abandon who you were. It required you to be who you were inside Babylon, which meant accepting that Babylon was the frame within which your identity now existed. You could practice your religion. You could maintain your language. You could tell your children stories about Jerusalem and the temple and the covenant. You just had to do all of it here, in this city, under this power, with the understanding that the frame itself was not negotiable. The exiles sat with that reality for decades. And in sitting with it, they did something that no one planned and no one predicted, and that Nebuchadnezzar, if he had been told it was happening, would probably not have considered significant enough to pay attention to. They figured out how to be Jewish without the temple. This sounds simple. It was one of the most profound religious transformations in human history. And it happened not through theological declaration or prophetic revelation alone, but through the grinding daily necessity of people who needed to maintain their relationship with God in conditions for which their tradition had not prepared them. The temple system was elaborate and specific. There were sacrifices to be offered at particular times, in particular ways, by particular priests, in the particular place where God's presence dwelt. There were festivals tied to the agricultural calendar of the land of Israel. There were purity regulations that assumed access to ritual facilities that existed in the temple complex. The whole system was built around a physical location that was now rubble. What do you do when the system requires a building and the building no longer exists? You find out what the system was actually for. Underneath the building, the scroll became the temple, not immediately. not through a single decision, but gradually, across the decades of exile. The community that had carried its texts from Jerusalem and continued reading them and studying them and arguing about them developed a relationship with its written tradition that was different in kind from what it had been before. Before the exile, the texts were part of the temple system, supporting structures for the central institution. After the exile, with the central institution gone, the texts became the institution. The practice of gathering to read and discuss the Torah, which many scholars suggest may have roots in this period, would eventually become the synagogue, the form of Jewish worship that survived 2,000 years without a temple and without a homeland. The books written and edited during the exile, including significant portions of what became the Hebrew Bible, carried the theological weight of people who had learned that God could be present where there was no temple, that the covenant could be maintained where there was no land, that the promises were portable in a way that no one had fully grasped before they were forced to find out. Ezekiel was among the first wave of exiles, taken to Babylon in 597. His book is one of the strangest and most difficult in the Hebrew Bible, full of visions that strain the capacity of language to describe. But underneath the strange imagery there is a theological move that, once you see it, changes how you read everything that follows. His first vision, the vision of the divine chariot, comes to him by the Chebar Canal in Babylon, not in Jerusalem, not in the temple, in Babylon. The vision shows the divine presence mounted on a chariot with wheels within wheels, capable of moving in any direction without turning. The message of the vision is not subtle. The God of Israel is not confined to a particular location. He was not left behind in Jerusalem when the people were taken away. He is here. The wheels turn. This was not a comfortable message for people who had organized their entire theological world around the idea that Jerusalem was the place where God's presence was specifically located. It was a harder and deeper message, which was that the presence had never been exclusively located anywhere, and the destruction of the location did not mean what they feared it meant. What it meant instead was something that took a generation to absorb fully. The covenant was not over. The promises were not cancelled. The line of David was still alive in Babylon, eating palace rations, waiting. The community of exiles was still intact. The texts were still being read. The children were still being taught. All of this was happening while Nebuchadnezzar went on building. He completed more of the processional way. He continued the restoration of temples across his empire. He conducted additional military campaigns in the years after Jerusalem's fall, including a long siege of the Phoenician city of Tyre that lasted 13 years and produced limited results despite the enormous effort involved. He campaigned toward Egypt. He administered an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. He was in his 50s by the time the Jerusalem campaign was fully behind him. A man in the middle of a long and successful reign, surrounded by the evidence of everything he had built, governing a city that the ancient world acknowledged as the most magnificent in existence. And somewhere in the districts of his empire, in the communities along the canals where the exiles had been settled, people were sitting in the evenings and reading from their scrolls and asking questions about what God was doing in all of this. And the answers they were working out were going to outlast his empire by more than 2,000 years. He did not know about those conversations. He was building walls. They were building something that walls cannot contain. The psalm does not end with weeping. It ends, startlingly, with rage. The final verses of Psalm 137 are not the words of peaceful acceptance. They are the words of people who have not been broken, who are still capable of fierce attachment to the city they have lost, who want the people who destroyed it to know what destruction feels like. The rage is part of the survival. The weeping is part of the survival. The determination to remember, to not let Jerusalem dissolve into comfortable assimilation in a foreign place, is part of the survival. Babylon did not hear that. Babylon was not listening, but it was written down. And writing things down, as the exiles were learning, is how you make sure that the things that matter do not disappear. Just because the people who care about them are a long way from home. There is a question about Nebuchadnezzar that the Babylonian records raise without answering. It becomes visible only when you lay different kinds of evidence side by side and notice where they fail to match. The question is this: what happened to him in the later years of his reign? The Babylonian Chronicle is detailed about the earlier part of Nebuchadnezzar's kingship, the campaigns in the west, the sieges, the military operations of the first 2 decades. But as the reign progresses, the documentation changes. The continuous stream of campaign chronicles that covers the early years grows thinner. The later years are less well represented in what survives. This happens with ancient rulers. Archives are incomplete. Clay tablets break. The accidents of preservation mean our knowledge is always patchy. But there is something about the particular shape of the silence in Nebuchadnezzar's later records that has prompted careful scholars to ask careful questions. A man who pressed his name into tens of thousands of bricks. A man whose entire relationship with legitimacy and order depended on the continuous demonstration that he was fulfilling his obligations to the gods and the empire. That man goes quieter in the surviving record during what appears to be a period in his later years. The silence does not prove anything. It is a gap, not an account. Both the Babylonian record and the Hebrew record have gaps in this period, and the gaps fall in different places and are shaped by different pressures. Babylon did not record its king's weaknesses. The entire system of royal inscription was built on the premise that the king acted with divine sanction and produced divinely approved results. There was no genre of Babylonian literature that said the king was absent for several years, and the administration managed without him. If something happened to Nebuchadnezzar that removed him from effective rule for any period of time, the Babylonian record would not have preserved that fact. It would have been managed, minimized, worked around. The Hebrew record had its own pressures. It recorded Nebuchadnezzar primarily as the instrument of divine judgment, shaped by the theological argument being made about the sovereignty of God over earthly power. Babylon left out weakness. Israel left out accommodation. The gaps in each record are shaped by what each civilization needed to believe about itself and about the forces that determined human affairs. When you lay the 2 records side by side and notice where the silences fall and why they fall there, you are not finding the objective truth that both records obscure. You are finding the shape of 2 different attempts to understand what it means that human beings live and die and build and destroy and remember and forget. The silence does not tell us what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. It tells us something about the shape of what could not be said. There is a passage in the book of Daniel, chapter 4, written in the first person, as if from Nebuchadnezzar himself. No other passage in Daniel takes this form. It describes the king at the height of his power, standing on the roof of his palace, looking out over everything he has built. That moment, and what follows it, is where this story goes next. Start with the roof. He has stood on a roof like this before. The first time, he was 14 years old. The city below him was not yet what it would become, and he was not yet what he would become. And he went back inside because he had things to learn, and the world was not waiting for him to finish learning them. That was roughly 50 years ago. Now Nebuchadnezzar is standing on the roof of his palace in Babylon, and the city that stretches out in every direction below him is the largest, most magnificent urban landscape that any human being alive at this moment has ever seen. The processional way runs from the Ishtar Gate through the center of the city, its glazed bricks catching the afternoon light. The ziggurat rises above the temple precinct. The canals that run through the city catch the reflection of the sky. The walls extend around everything, massive and unbroken, promising what walls always promise, which is that the order inside them is safe from whatever is outside them. He built this, not metaphorically, not in the sense that a president builds an economy or a general wins a war. He actually built it in the physical sense, by directing resources and labor and engineering knowledge toward specific ends over decades. His name is in the walls. His name is in the foundations of the temples. His name is in the bricks of the processional way, under the feet of everyone who walks it. He says, "According to the book of Daniel, is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence, and for the glory of my majesty." Hold that sentence for a moment before moving past it. Most readers reach that sentence and hear pride, arrogance, the sound of a man setting himself up for a fall. And the story that follows does involve a fall. So, reading the sentence as set up for what comes next is natural. Read it again without that assumption. Is Nebuchadnezzar incorrect? Babylon is great. He did build it. The royal residence is real. His majesty is real, in the sense that matters in the ancient world, which is the sense of demonstrated power and divine sanction and 40 years of successful governance. Everything in the sentence is factually accurate. The problem is not that the sentence is wrong. The problem is the word built. He built it. Past tense, first person singular, subject, verb, object. He is the builder. Babylon is the thing built. Between the builder and the built thing, there is a claim about the source of power that is, in both the Babylonian theological framework and the Hebrew theological framework, the one claim that no human being is permitted to make without consequence. In the Babylonian understanding, Nebuchadnezzar built Babylon because Marduk gave him the materials, the mandate, the divine approval, and the sustained protection that made 40 years of successful rule possible. He was the instrument. Marduk was the source. The inscriptions he spent his reign producing say exactly this. Over and over, in careful formal language, the king acts for the god. The king is the god's servant. The glory belongs to the divine order that selected the king for this purpose. The sentence on the roof says something different. It says, "I did this. My power, my glory." The shift from instrument to source. From the Hebrew perspective, the problem is even more fundamental. The God of Israel had made it as clear as language could make it that the one thing he would not share was the acknowledgement that the source of order and power resided in anything other than himself. "You shall have no other gods before me," including the God you have made out of your own achievements. Both theological systems, the one Nebuchadnezzar believed in and the one he had spent his career operating against, arrive at the same verdict on the sentence he speaks. On the roof, "You have claimed the wrong thing." And then the voice comes. Daniel records it with the abruptness of something that does not allow time for processing. While the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. "The kingdom has departed from you. You will be driven from men. You will dwell with the beasts of the field. You will eat grass like an ox. 7 times will pass over you. until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. What follows in Daniel's account is something that has no parallel in ancient literature. The greatest king in the world stops being a king, stops being a man, in the sense of a man who lives within human society and operates by human rules and maintains the identity that human society assigns. He is driven out. He eats grass. His hair grows long. His nails grow like claws. He lives outside, in the elements, for 7 years. Boanthropy, the condition in which a person believes themselves to be a bovine and behaves accordingly, exists in the medical literature. It is extraordinarily rare, but it is real, and the symptoms described in Daniel bear a resemblance to documented cases that is difficult to dismiss entirely. Whether you read Daniel 4 as literal history, as theological literature, or as a tradition that may have historical roots that have been reshaped by the purposes of the text, what it is describing at the level of human experience is recognizable. It is describing the collapse of a self, not a physical collapse, a structural one, the internal architecture that holds a person together as a coherent identity, the accumulated weight of roles and relationships and purposes, and the ongoing sense that you are the person you understand yourself to be, coming apart. For Nebuchadnezzar, that architecture was specific and identifiable. He was the king who maintained order. He was the servant of Marduk. He was the builder of Babylon. He was the one in whom the divine mandate met the human world and produced results that could be measured in temples restored and walls raised and enemies defeated and tribute received. His identity was not separate from his function. His function was his identity. The man and the role had been welded together so completely over 40 years that the weld itself was the thing, and there was nothing underneath it that remained clearly distinguishable as purely personal. What happens when you remove all of that? Not gradually, all at once. No throne, no court, no rituals to perform, no inscriptions to commission, no enemies to defeat, no brick to press his name into, no audience before whom to be the king, no temple in which to fulfill his obligations to Marduk, no processional way to walk, no city to look out over from the roof. What is left? Grass, sky, the sound of his own breathing. 7 years. There is something in Daniel's account that is easy to miss if you are reading for the theological argument rather than for the human experience inside the theological argument. Nebuchadnezzar does not die in those 7 years. He is not destroyed. He is not replaced. He persists. He eats and breathes and exists, even in conditions that strip away every category his civilization had for what existence meant. He is still there when the 7 years end, still capable of looking up and having his reason return and going back to the palace and taking up the kingship again. Something kept him alive. When Nebuchadnezzar lifts his eyes to heaven and his reason returns, Daniel records what he says. He blesses the Most High. He praises the one who lives forever. He says all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth, and none can stay his hand, or say to him, "What have you done?" This is not a conversion statement in the religious sense. He does not become an Israelite. He does not renounce Marduk. He does not dismantle the temples he built. When he returns to Babylon, he returns as king of Babylon, which means he returns as the man who serves Marduk and maintains the Babylonian order. But something has changed in the sentence structure of his understanding. On the roof, he said, "I built this After 7 years, he says he does according to his will, and none can stay his hand. The subject has moved. He is no longer the subject. Something else is. For the Babylonian theological framework, this looks like the king correctly re-establishing his relationship with the divine order after a period of dangerous presumption. For the Hebrew theological framework, this looks like a king being brought, by extreme means, to a recognition of the sovereignty of the God of heaven. For the human being inside both of those frameworks, it looks like a man who found the thing that was underneath the roll only after the roll was completely stripped away. The tragedy, if you want to call it that, is not that it happened to him. The tragedy is that it required what it required to get him there. 40 years of building the greatest city in the world. 40 years of pressing his name into bricks and commissioning inscriptions and walking at the head of the Akitu procession as the representative of the divine order. 40 years of being right, by every external measure, about what order looked like and how to maintain it. And then the grass, and the sky, and the sound of his own breathing. And after that, finally, the understanding that the order was real, but he was not its source. He had been trying to prove that for 40 years. In the building and the inscribing and the campaigning and the consolidating, he had been making the case to the world and to himself that the order was real and that his place at the center of it was justified. He was right that the order was real. He was wrong about where it came from, and it took 7 years of living outside, by whatever name you give those 7 years, for him to be able to hold those two things at once. The boy on the roof, all those years ago, had looked out over a city that was not yet what it would become and gone back inside because he had things to learn. He spent 40 years learning the wrong lesson. It turned out the right one was waiting outside the walls, in the grass, under the sky, with no audience and no title and no inscription to prove he had ever existed. The bricks with his name in them are still in the ground at Babylon, tens of thousands of them, pressed into the earth, waiting for the next excavation to bring them up. His name, over and over, the evidence of everything he was certain about, and everything he built on the foundation of that certainty. The grass he ate left no record. The lifting of his eyes to heaven left no physical artifact, but Daniel wrote it down, and writing things down, as we have seen, is how the things that matter survive the things that seemed more permanent. In 562 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar died. The Babylonian records note his death the way they note most things. A reign ends. A new king begins. The administration continues. The temples require their daily rituals. The canals require their maintenance. The empire requires its management. The machinery of Babylon does not pause for the death of the man who spent 43 years building it, because the machinery is now larger than any individual man, which was, in a certain sense, exactly what he had been trying to achieve. He had reigned longer than any other king in the history of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. 43 years. In a world where empires rose and fell within decades, and kings lasted on average perhaps 15 years. 43 years of continuous, effective rule was an achievement without parallel in his context, and the empire he left behind lasted 23 more years before Cyrus the Great of Persia walked into Babylon in 539 BCE and took it without a battle. 23 years, not 200, not 1,000, not the permanence that the inscriptions promised and the walls implied and the name pressed into tens of thousands of bricks was meant to guarantee. 23 years after Nebuchadnezzar died, The city he had built to last forever became the capital of someone else's empire. The dynasty collapsed almost immediately after him. His son Amel-Marduk was assassinated after 2 years. His successor, Neriglissar, ruled for 4 years. The next king lasted less than a year. Nabonidus, the final Babylonian king, had a difficult and unusual reign that ended when Cyrus arrived and the city surrendered without resistance. The walls that were wide enough for 2 chariots to pass each other on top did not save Babylon from Persia. The gates covered in lapis lazuli and the animals of the gods were opened to a foreign king inside 23 years of the man who built them dying in his bed. Nebuchadnezzar could not have known this. He died at the peak of his empire, surrounded by the evidence of everything he had built, with no obvious indication that the structure he had spent his life constructing would dissolve so quickly after his hands left it. But here is the thing about legacy that the inscriptions and the bricks and the walls cannot capture, and that Nebuchadnezzar, for all his extraordinary intelligence and all his decades of accumulating experience, appears not to have fully grasped. You do not own what you leave behind. The bricks have his name in them, but the bricks do not care whose name is in them. The inscriptions describe his achievements, but the inscriptions cannot enforce the meaning he intended them to carry. The walls protected Babylon for decades, but they could not protect the idea of Babylon from what happens to ideas when the people who built them are gone. What you leave behind belongs to whoever finds it, and what Nebuchadnezzar left behind was found by 2 very different groups of people, who did 2 very different things with it. The first group was the parade of ancient historians, beginning with Herodotus and continuing through the classical tradition, who wrote about Babylon with a mixture of wonder and distance that turned it into legend. Herodotus described the walls. He described the ziggurat. He preserved the sense of the thing, the overwhelming scale of it, the way Babylon existed as a kind of proof that human beings could build something so large it crossed the line from the practical into the mythological. The second group was the exilic Jewish community, who took the memory of Nebuchadnezzar back to their texts and their theology and made him into something that no Babylonian inscription would have recognized. In the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar is the central figure of a series of stories about the relationship between earthly power and divine sovereignty. He builds the golden statue. He throws the 3 young men into the furnace. He has dreams that only the God of Israel can interpret. He goes mad and eats grass and comes back. He praises the God of heaven. He is, in Daniel's account, the living demonstration that even the greatest power on earth is subject to a power greater than itself. In the book of Jeremiah, he is the servant of God, the instrument of judgment against a people who had broken their covenant. In Lamentations, he is the agent of destruction, the one through whose hands the worst thing that could happen did happen. In Psalm 137, he is the unnamed presence behind everything. The reason the psalmist is sitting by a foreign river unable to sing, he appears more often in the Hebrew Bible than any other foreign king in the entire text, more than the pharaohs of Egypt, who enslaved the Israelites for generations, more than Cyrus the Great, who freed the exiles from Babylon and sent them home. He wanted to be remembered. He succeeded beyond anything the bricks could have produced. But the memory he got was not the memory he commissioned. He commissioned the memory of the builder, the restorer, the servant of Marduk, the man who maintained the order of the world. He commissioned it carefully and at enormous expense, in glazed brick and carved stone and pressed clay, and the architecture of a city designed to make his power self-evident to anyone who approached it. The memory he got was the memory of the destroyer, the memory of the man who burned the temple, the memory of the man who took a people from their land and carried them to a foreign river where they sat and wept, the memory of the man who blinded a king and killed that king's sons and left a city empty on a hillside. That is the memory that survived. That is the memory that has been passed from generation to generation for 2,500 years in the prayers and the fasts and the liturgy of a people who are still here when the empire he built is dust. On Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, Jews around the world still observe a fast. They sit on the floor of the synagogue. They read from the Book of Lamentations. The day commemorates the destruction of the temple, and by extension, the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, and by extension the accumulated catastrophes that the Jewish tradition has attached to this date across centuries. His name is in the day, 2,500 years after he died. His name is still in the day. And in the 1980s, a man named Saddam Hussein was building a palace on a hill overlooking the ruins of ancient Babylon, in the country that was once Mesopotamia, and he ordered that new bricks be laid in the ancient ruins with a new inscription. The inscription read, in paraphrase, "This was built in the era of Saddam Hussein, who rebuilt civilization and rebuilt Babylon." The implication was unmistakable. Saddam was positioning himself as the successor to Nebuchadnezzar, drawing a line from the greatest king of ancient Babylon to the current leader of Iraq, borrowing the weight of 25 centuries of association between Babylon and power to lend his own rule a grandeur it could not generate from its own history. He pressed his name into the bricks of a man dead for 2,500 years. He needed to borrow Nebuchadnezzar's memory because his own was not sufficient. That is perhaps the most clarifying fact about the nature of Nebuchadnezzar's legacy. His name is still worth borrowing. His association with the greatest city of the ancient world is still potent enough that a dictator in the 20th century thought that connecting himself to it would make him more formidable. He wanted to be remembered. He is remembered. He is remembered as the builder who became dust. He is remembered as the destroyer who made something permanent by destroying it. He is remembered in the bricks that say his name, and in the day that carries his shadow, and in the ruins that draw archaeologists and tourists and soldiers to a stretch of desert in central Iraq that has been continuously meaningful to human beings for longer than almost anywhere else on earth. He could not have imagined the shape of it. He wanted to control how history remembered him. He did everything in his power to do exactly that. He wrote his name into the physical fabric of the world in a way that no natural force could entirely erase. But the people he thought he had erased, the people he carried away from their city to his, the people he expected to dissolve into the machinery of empire and be forgotten, they were the ones who carried his name furthest. Not in bricks, in grief, in scripture, in the memory of a fire that, 2,600 years later, people still sit on the floor to mourn. He wanted to be remembered. He could not have imagined how. There is a place in central Iraq, about 90 kilometers south of Baghdad, where the ground rises and falls in patterns that do not look natural. The mounds stretch across a flat plain in shapes that anyone who has spent time around archaeological sites recognizes immediately. These are not geological formations. They are the remains of structures, walls and rooms and streets and foundations, compressed by centuries of abandonment and flood and the weight of the earth that covered them, into the particular kind of organized irregularity that means something was here. This is Babylon, not the Babylon of the glazed bricks and the lapis lazuli lions and the processional way stretching toward the Ishtar Gate. That Babylon exists now in fragments distributed across the museums of the world. In the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, and the British Museum in London, and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, and dozens of smaller collections on every inhabited continent, the Babylon that was actually here, in this place, is the mounds, the compressed earth, the broken bricks, the silence of a city that was once the loudest place in the world. When archaeologists began excavating the site systematically in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they found exactly what the inscriptions had promised. They found his name everywhere, pressed into the bricks. Thousands and thousands of bricks. The same formula repeated in cuneiform until it became almost a texture of the earth itself. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, son of Nabopolassar, who built this and restored that and cared for the temple of Marduk. He is still in the ground here. He will be in the ground here as long as there is ground. In the 1980s, Saddam Hussein arrived at this place with a different agenda than the archaeologists. He saw in the ancient king a model for his own ambitions, a Mesopotamian ruler who had built an empire and a city that the entire world acknowledged as supreme, who had defeated the enemies of his people and demonstrated that Iraq, or the land that became Iraq, was capable of producing civilizations that the rest of the world could not match. Saddam ordered the construction of a palace on an artificial hill overlooking the ruins of Babylon, and he ordered that new bricks be laid in the ruins of the ancient city, stamped with an inscription that read, in paraphrase, in the era of Saddam Hussein, the guardian of Iraq, Babylon was rebuilt, his name, laid next to Nebuchadnezzar's name, in the walls of a city that Nebuchadnezzar had built. The gesture was so transparent in its need that it becomes, on reflection, almost moving. This is what the name Nebuchadnezzar was still worth in the 20th century. Worth enough that a man who wanted the world to take him seriously would press his own name into the ground next to it and hope that the proximity would transfer some of the weight. It did not work. Saddam's Iraq collapsed under the combined pressure of its own brutality and the military force of the world's then dominant power. His palace on the hill above Babylon was occupied by soldiers, and the site itself was used as a military base in ways that caused measurable damage to the ancient ruins beneath it. Nebuchadnezzar's bricks are still in the ground. His name is still in them. His borrower's name is there too now, and in 500 years, if someone excavates that site with the patience and care it deserves, they will find both names in the same layers, and they will have to think carefully about what it means that the later man needed the earlier man's name to make himself feel real. Now, on a different continent and in a different register entirely, it is the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av. In synagogues in Jerusalem and New York and London and Buenos Aires and Melbourne and Cape Town and every other city where Jewish communities have gathered across the 2,500 years since the first exile, people are sitting on the floor, not in chairs, on the floor, or on low seats close to the floor, a physical posture of mourning that the tradition has prescribed since the Talmudic period. They are fasting. They are reading from the Book of Lamentations. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow has she become. She who was great among the nations. The city is Jerusalem. The occasion being mourned is the destruction of the temple. Both destructions. Actually, the first in 586 BCE and the second in 70 CE, are commemorated on this same day, because the tradition noticed that both happened in the same month and drew from that correspondence a conclusion about the weight of this particular date in the calendar of history. Nebuchadnezzar's name is not spoken during the Tisha B'Av service. You could attend the entire day of fasting and prayer and communal mourning without hearing his name mentioned once. And yet he is in the day the way the foundation is, in the building, not visible, not named, but present in the structure of everything. The fast exists because of what he ordered. The lamentations are read because of what his soldiers did. The posture of mourning, the sitting on the floor, the shoes left at the door, is a posture developed to mark the magnitude of what happened when his army came over the walls of Jerusalem, 2,500 years later. In every city where Jews live, the day remembers him whether his name is spoken or not. There is a child in a synagogue somewhere right now, sitting on the floor next to her parents, hearing the words of lamentations read in a language she is still learning. Not yet old enough to fully understand what is being mourned or why the mourning is still necessary after all this time. She will ask questions later. Why are we sitting on the floor? Who destroyed the temple? What happened to the people who were taken away? The answers to those questions will include, eventually, a name, Nebuchadnezzar. She will hear it for the first time, and it will mean nothing to her. Just a strange and difficult name from a story she does not yet know. And then she will learn the story, in pieces, over years. And the name will accumulate weight as she learns what belongs to it. She will learn about the fire first, the temple burning, the people walking away from the city in chains, the long road to Babylon, and later, if she is curious, she will go looking for the rest of it. She will find the bricks with his name in them. She will find the Chronicle with its dry administrative record of the siege. She will find the Ishtar Gate in Berlin, or photographs of it, and she will stand in front of it or look at it on a screen and feel the thing that everyone who encounters it properly feels, which is that this is too beautiful to be the creation of something simple and too large to have been made by someone who did not believe absolutely in what he was building. She will have to hold both things at once, the builder and the destroyer, the man who pressed his name into 10,000 bricks, and the man whose name is pressed into a day of mourning that has outlasted his empire by more than 2 millennia. She will discover, if she keeps looking, that neither version is complete without the other, that the Babylon of the glazed bricks and the Jerusalem of the burning temple are not two separate stories that happen to share a name. They are one story, told from two sides of a distance that history has never fully closed. He built a city to make his name permanent. He wrote his name into 10,000 bricks. He commanded that his achievements be recorded for eternity. And they were, but the people he carried away from Jerusalem, the people he displaced, the people he expected to disappear into the machinery of empire. They were the ones who carried his name furthest, not in bricks, in grief, in scripture, in the memory of a fire that, 2,600 years later, people still sit on the floor to mourn. He wanted to be remembered. He could not have imagined how. The bricks are still in the ground at Babylon. His name is still in them, pressed there by hands that have been dust for 25 centuries, waiting for the next careful brush to remove the accumulated earth and reveal the cuneiform beneath. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, beloved of Marduk, restorer of Exile and Isidar, still there, still saying the same thing it has always said, still waiting for someone to walk past slowly enough to read it